of what we're selling them for in bookstores. They're going to give them away. You're not old enough to remember the old book club shtick was you get, you get a free book. Any book you want, it comes free. You sign up, and then for the rest of your life, you're going to get a new book every month. And they just keep coming. Um, and so publishers thought that was the end of publishing. Well, and bookstores thought it was the end of bookselling until the bookstores realized, huh, these Doubleday was the big one, Doubleday Book Club, and there are many others. They send millions of promotions out, millions of deals and exposure. They place their ads in all the magazines that nobody can afford to put an ad in if you're a book publisher. Millions and millions of impressions. And then they offer the book for either free or half the price that bookstores offer it for. And they sell 3, 4, 500,000 copies. But millions and millions of people have been hit with that impression. And it didn't cost the publisher a nickel. All that marketing. And it wasn't long before the booksellers started asking the publishers, when is your author's book going to be launched in the book clubs? Because they realized as soon as those millions of impressions went out, what happened to the store sales if they put that book in the front window? Sales went crazy. So the reason that giving books away or having them promoted by an authority, in this case, the Doubleday Book Club was established. People recognize that as an authority of quality writing. And so people were impressed by it with all these marketing things, and they went out and bought it because people talked about it. In the Christian world, the biggest and best example is that Ken Taylor, who at the time was the editorial director of Moody, wanted his kids to understand the Bible, and they couldn't understand it because all they had was the King James.
The Living Bible.
All they had was the King James Bible. So when he was going back and forth between Wheaton and Chicago on a train over a period of years, he wrote the Living Bible for his kids. But he couldn't get anybody to publish it. Heresy. Nobody would publish it until somebody somehow got a copy of the Gospel of John to Billy Graham. And Billy Graham used it at a crusade. By that time, Ken Taylor had given up trying to get a publisher to publish it, so he started his own company called Tyndale. And when Graham used that book, it was the person of authority that said to people, this will help you better understand the scripture. Not billions, but hundreds of millions of copies have been sold. So this theory is not a theory. It's not a hypothesis. It's true that people will talk about books, and people who hear about those books, if they trust the person who's talked to them about it, whether it's a pastor or a friend or a family or a spouse, whatever, or an institution like Doubleday Book Club, they'll buy the book. So that's the word of mouth today is even better because of the internet. We've got more reach than we've ever had at a very small price.
So you're saying we shouldn't be afraid to give away the PDF of our book or the ebook or whatever it is.
You're a nutcase if you don't, because you want to get the book into distribution. This is not just a ministry thing. This is a marketing thing. They happen not many times does ministry and marketing align. In this case, they do. You want to get that book. You want to help that author get his message out to as many people as possible. The best way to do that is to get the book in the hands of as many people as possible. And if you can eliminate the purchasing decision by giving it to them, they'll read it and then they'll start talking about it. And then all of a sudden, their buddy goes out and they're not going to get a free book. They're going to go out and buy a book. Then they love it. Talk about it. So it is the best marketing tool an author has.
That's got my head spinning, man. I've heard that from not just you, but other people, but I'll tell you, it takes courage and a spirit of generosity and love for people in order to do that. But it's counterintuitive. You think, well, if I just give my intellectual property away, and obviously you still need to sell the book. But if you're clingy to stuff, it's the opposite. And so, in fact, that's a good segue to the master plan of evangelism. Because, you know, as we talk about marketing content, you know, Jesus came and marketed the kingdom in the most broad sense, like a non-pejorative sense of marketing the kingdom. And so, you know, Robert Coleman has sold, you know, millions of copies of this book, The Master Plan of Evangelism. So tell us the inside scoop, because a lot of people, especially my dad's age, were really impacted by it. But even people in my generation,
Yeah.
you know, I'm 38, have been impacted by it. So tell me the story behind The Master Plan of Evangelism.
Well, confession's good for the soul. The book was published in 1963. Okay. It was published in 1963, which means it was written in 60 to 62. Okay. And my calculation says it was published 61 years ago. 61 years ago. Written 62, 63 years ago. I was born in 1953. I was 10. When I was 16, well, actually, when I was 15, I worked in the warehouse of Fleming Rebel in the summers. And I did that 15, 16, a little bit of 17 years old. And my first experience, this is its current edition here. My first experience with the Master Plan of Evangelism was I was picking orders in the warehouse. I'd never heard of it. I mean, we had hundreds of books at Rebel, so I'd heard of authors. You know, we had author friends like Dale and Roy and the Grahams, and those were family friends because we published them. But they were more celebrity kind of authors. I'd never heard of Robert Coleman. I never heard of this book. All I knew about this book as a 15-year-old was this must be an amazing book because it seems to be in every single order. Sometimes, and we were taking orders for bookstores. We were shipping books to bookstores. So it was always 4, 5, 6, 10, 12 copies, almost every order. And so all I knew about this book was somebody is really buying this book. This must be an amazing book. 15, 16, 17. I accepted Christ when I was 18. We didn't live, even though we're the largest Christian publisher in the world at the time, our family was not a active evangelical personal relationship with Christ family.
Really?
We were professional Christians. We knew the language.
Okay. Yeah.
People who, our authors knew us. We prayed together. But we didn't have a relationship. We just knew the language. So when I was 18, I accepted Christ to a college ministry in California. Came home, told my dad about it. In fact, irony is that summer was the summer of 72 when Bill Bright was launching a new campus ministry in Dallas. It was called Expo 72. And we published the book, Come Help Change My World, which was the book that he was using in that crusade.
I have a fasting and prayer book by Bill Bright.
Yep. That was one of his things.
Okay.
And so I called my dad, who had been on the stage talking about the book with Bill at this event in Dallas Stadium, not the football stadium, but the old Cotton Bowl. And I told him that I just accepted Christ. And he said, oh, that's nice. He didn't have a clue.
What?
And it just been with Bright, right? Um,
Oh, wow.
so it was a year later, when I was 19, that I went back to this church in California and did a testimony. It happened that Dad and Mom were there with my sister visiting, and they all accepted Christ that night in 1973.
That's crazy. Thanks for sharing that. Yeah, I didn't know that.
Yeah. He went back to Jersey, led his brother, who was the vice president of Revell, to Christ. And in 73 to 76, Christian publishing went bananas. In a front cover Time magazine. I mean, Christian publishing, the Jesus movement, it was going nuts.
Oh yeah, the
And
Jesus
all
movement.
of that started back in those early to mid 70s with Revell leading the way, publishing Corey Ten Boom, Grams, Francis Schaeffer, I mean, you name it, Jim Dobson. It really was an explosion of Christian publishing.
I mean, at the time, so you're saying Revell was the biggest Christian publisher at the time?
Yeah.
Who was, was anyone a close second or third?
Word was the close second. Now, Revell didn't do Bibles.
Okay.
Zondervan did Bibles. Zondervan was not doing many books, but they did a lot of reference books, academic books. They had just launched NIV. Nelson did books, but more Bibles. They had just launched New King James back in the early 70s.
Yeah.
Mid to late 70s. So Revell was the player. I mean, on the Christian bestseller list, we'd have 6 of the 10 for years. And all the time I was, and this is my segue into Master Plan. So I didn't read it. I mean, I didn't know about it. But what the book does, and I encourage anybody who's listening to us today, go buy this book. And 2 things are going to happen. Your life is going to be changed, and you're going to change other people's lives because you won't be able to stop talking about how amazing this book is. I was trained as an editor, so I read very critically. I didn't find anything I'd edit. I mean, I think it's amazing. The only thing I would change is the title, because it says the Master Plan of Evangelism. It should say the Master's Plan of Evangelism, because what the book does is lay out 8 principles that Jesus used in building disciples. In a nutshell.
Do you think it should be called the Master's Plan of Discipleship?
Well, I think that if you read the book, or when you read the book, you'll better understand why that's a great question. But in its time, I suspect the word evangelism was a real catchphrase, where the word of discipleship, of course, we had the Cost of Discipleship and other classics, but until you read this book, you're probably not going to have as deep an understanding of what it means to go and make disciples as opposed to go and convert. And so I think for this book, if they had used the word discipleship, it might not have resonated with as many people, because discipleship is a little bit more jargon, a little bit more kind of within the beltway type thinking or communicating.
Yeah, it's like in vogue now, but you're saying back then it was.
We're talking 61 years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah. And 61 years ago, Graham had his crusade. His first crusade was 1948. 1948. So in 60, he was the guy. Of course, years before him was Billy Sunday, but and years before him would have been Moody and others. But so evangelism, I think, was a catchword back then. And this book is written for Christian leaders. I mean, you can get something from it no matter what role you play in the kingdom. But its primary audience, I think, is for leaders and pastors. Um, and but the point is, let's look at Jesus and see how he built the foundation to spread the gospel. That's the premise of this book. And it's all about Jesus. It's not about any individual. The first three that he got on board were poor fishermen, and Peter, James, and John. And it really it flips the pyramid, if you will, to Jesus wasn't thinking, although he had big crowds and he did major, events, but his invested time was with a small group of people that were disciples, which in Greek means student or leader, eager to learn. And he knew that in order to put the foundation together, which would eventually be the beginning of the church, he would have to have guys that were sold out to him and his plan. And Jesus' plan, as Coleman lays it out, Jesus' plan is to win the world. Win
I bet if you ask me,
Win the world. How do you win the world? You start with 3 poor fishermen? Uneducated? Yeah, perfect. It reminds me a little of and this is a stretch, but trust me here. Jesus' approach to discipleship reminds me a little bit of Amway's approach and every other network marketer. And what they're looking for are people who will do exactly what they say and don't go off script because they know the script works. If you start thinking too much and tweaking the Amway script, you won't have the success that you do, or any other. I'm just using that because most people would know about Amway. But Jesus knew the script. He had the plan. He was the plan. And the only way this was going to work initially was to get a small group of guys surrounded by another dozen or so sold out women who were going to support him. And this small group of disciples was going to listen, obey, and follow. Listen, obey, and follow. It's a Matthew 16:24, which is my life verse. If you want to be my disciple, give up your will for mine. Pick up the cross I'm going to give you and follow me. So Coleman starts from that point in terms of providing the quote master plan of evangelism for us today. At the end of each chapter, there's about a paragraph or two that says something like, thoughts for today. In other words, he goes through these 8 things, that Jesus practiced and taught and emulated as an example that the disciples saw and lived and learned, and eventually it became who they were also, so that they could be disciples for the next group. And so Jesus was giving these examples so that they could go out after he left and resurrected. And then what happened? I have to leave so you can do more. As long as Jesus was here, the Holy Spirit was fully in him, right? But when the Holy Spirit was given to those who believed, now you got a whole bunch of Jesuses out there.
And the rest is history. I mean, he basically lit a fire that took over the whole Roman Empire and then the world.
Correct. And it was so palpable that people could see who had been with Jesus. We have that in Acts. So what Coleman says is start with Jesus. It's not about method. It's not about program. It's about life. It's about learning who Jesus is. In 1986, and I love to talk these stories, so you give me the stop, we're finished. In 1986, I was a publisher at Thomas Nelson. I did books. The other guy who did Bibles was my partner, and he was a guy named Frank, and the guy who owned the company is a guy named Sam. And so we get a call one day from Sam and says, come on up, I want you to meet somebody. Well, Sam signed my check, so his priorities were always mine. And so off we go to meet with Sam, which we know is going to be a wasted hour, because they always were wasted hours when Sam had a friend come into town. It was fun, but we didn't get any work done. Well, this was a little different because he had a guy in the office who's probably, I'm guessing he was in his mid to late 30s. Introduced himself as Steve Haney, never heard of him. But he was the new president of InterVarsity Christian Fellowship. So now, well, okay, now we've got somebody who's not just Sam's friend, but somebody who's going to be interesting to talk to. We had no idea what the agenda was. He said, "Here, I'm here to share with you something, and then to ask you a question." He says, "I came from being the provost at Seattle Pacific University, independent, evangelical, Christian college, highly regarded." He said, "To get into this school, you don't have to sign a statement of faith that we write. You have to write your statement of faith." So these kids that are applying and getting accepted are pretty strong Christians. And then he paused and he said, "But I had to give the page number in chapel." And Frank and I did just what you did, huh? He said, "They didn't know the Bible. I had to tell them what page I'm going to talk about." Kids who can write a statement of faith are biblically illiterate.
Huh.
1986.
Okay.
So then the question comes, first to me, Bruce, these kids are graduating a couple, 3 years. They're going to have families. And the next generation, their kids, are going to grow up with parents who don't know the Bible. Those kids are going to have kids, 2 generations. And not only do they don't know the Bible, they don't know God. And these are going to be Christians. So the question is, what kind of books are you going to write? Or what kind of books are you going to publish?
Wow.
That can speak
Mic drop.
to a biblically illiterate world? And that, I didn't have an answer. But the big question went to Frank, who was the Bible publisher. I was the book publisher. He's doing the Bible. He says to Frank, what kind of Bibles are you going to publish? What kind of aids and resources? What kind of study Bibles are you going to publish that will speak to someone who doesn't read the Bible? That was 1986. Jump ahead 2 generations-ish. We're in 1994, or we're 2024.
Yeah.
If you don't know if you don't read the Bible, and you don't study the Bible, and you won't know God. I read this morning in Hosea 6:6. I just want you to show love, and know me. Simple. How do you show God's love if you don't know God? So the master plan of evangelism is almost prophetic in what can happen 2 generations down the road. If the premise is you have to start with someone who's willing to learn and obey, disciple, and teach them by example and a small group so that they can go out and live an example and teach others in a small group. How does that work today?
Well, it's interesting because
Yeah.
I mean, I would say that now, at least in my circles, that's a common conversation. So what I hear you saying is basically 2 generations later, because I was born in 1986.
Mhm.
Um, in some circles, it's in vogue.
It is. And and I would suggest that those are small circles.
Okay, yeah.
Those are small circles.
But
You
what you're
know,
saying is, so what are you saying then?
what I'm saying is we have to take advantage of what we have today and the way people learn today, which is very different than it was 40 years ago. We now are visual. We now are soundbiting. We now are building relationships with people that we don't know. We call them friends. We have a generation that's looking for followers and for likes to validate their existence. That's a world that the master plan of evangelism lays out a plan to address, because we first have to, and I'll just breeze through these 8 things, but the first thing Jesus did was he selected the right people to start with. Okay, select the right people to start with. Not 100 people. The book, I don't know if you remember this one, he said, as best he can tell, the author of this book, Robert Coleman, perhaps as many as maybe 500 people committed their lives to Christ during his ministry. Maybe 500. Now, thousands were fed. Thousands were confronted with God's presence, which was the miracles affirmed God's presence, so they acknowledged what was happening. But how many after his resurrection? And he said, wait for me in Jerusalem. How many waited?
Oh,
Acts,
120. I mean,
120. It started, and now it didn't take more than a few weeks after the Holy Spirit showed up for that number to be 3,000, but still.
I mean that kind of goes to show to your point.
Exactly.
Like if 3,000 was a huge deal, well, that would have been condescending if it was any more than that. So
Correct.
that's strangely encouraging for me to hear because sometimes I'm like, man, what are we doing with our lives? Even in a sense as publishers, just to kind of bring it back to books, a lot of times we think, man, what does a book really do? And obviously we love books, but I heard when I was at Christian Product Expo, one of the bookstore owners said, books are little missionaries, and we get to send them out into the world in places that people who don't want to come into a church live and go. And I think the books have this unique ability to reach people. And so I'm encouraged by even just thinking about Robert Coleman. Anyway, I didn't want to cut you off too much. I think you were going.
No. I want to affirm that because in 1985, sorry, 1975. In 1975, I was fixing to graduate, to go to work. I was trained as an editor, so I was going to go work with authors. And we went the fall of 75, we went to an Army football game at West Point with my family. And the Army stadium is like the Michigan Stadium. It's built, or Rose Bowl, it's built into the ground. So from the outside, it doesn't look that big. But when you go in and you look down, it's like huge. Now, it doesn't seat as many as a Michigan. It's seated about 45,000. And it was full. And as the Army guys ran through the tunnel onto the field, and everybody's standing and cheering, they announced the attendance. And I hadn't stood up yet, but when they announced the attendance, I was standing and I looked all around me, and roughly 45,000 people were cheering and clapping. And for a moment, I caught what Christian book publishing does. We had just published a woman named Joyce Landorf, and we had just shipped 44,000 copies. And I sat there
Wow.
and went, wow, this is what it would look like if all those people who bought those books were in one place cheering. This is what it looks like. Never forget that.
That's awesome.
Each Christian book touches at least 3 people. Each Christian book is read 2.63 times. So even if you've sold a modest amount of 5,000 or 6,000 copies, that means that somewhere around 18,000 people have read it, which means that 18,000 families could be affected by that, which means that now we're talking 18 times 3. So we're only almost 50,000 people could be touched by that book that sold 6,000 copies. We got to remember, and I do a talk on this, people read books 2 eyes and 1 heart at a time. We're not publishing books for millions of people. We're publishing books for people, 1 at a time. So the more we can get those books into people's hands, the more books that we can publish or write, like Master Plan of Evangelism, 60 years later, that continues to have an amazing ministry that speaks to where people are. That's why I think this book is prophetic. It speaks to where the church is today. And it will speak to where the church is in 50 years, whatever that looks like. I read Oswald Chambers every morning, My Utmost for His Highest. It was published in 1940. It was written out of his sermon messages at the chapel that he spoke at in London Bible College. His wife put it together. He didn't even write it as a book. And here it is over almost 100 years, more than 100 years later. So the ministry of books, including Master Plan Evangelism, is so exciting and dynamic. And with the internet, there's lots of problems with the internet. We could spend hours talking about them. But we've never been able, authors or publishers, to be able to get the message in front of people for a less cost and a greater impact than we can today. So I would encourage you as a publisher to be as excited about the possibility of changing the world, because that's what we're about. And changed worlds, according to Master Plan of Evangelism, changed worlds come from changed lives. Change lives, change worlds.
Man, thank you for sharing that. Yeah, it's a humble position to be a publisher. I used to think publishers were the big dog. It's like the wrong kind of publishers that won't last might act like that, but
yeah,
really we're elevating authors who elevate the message, and the best message ultimately is anything that correlates and points back to Jesus.
Building the kingdom.
Yeah.
Building the kingdom. Jesus knew the plan. Jesus was the plan. He shared it with 3 people. Those people were in that greater circle of 12. And then you add a Stephen in, add a Malchus in, add a Paul in, add a Barnabas in. we're still dealing with a few people.
Yeah.
But when you put the few people who are disciples, not just converts, but disciples
Yeah.
who are committed to learning and teaching, and they take that life plan that Jesus lived, that they experienced, and take that to their small groups. That's why the church is growing. That's why the church is growing. Now, the institution of the church has all kinds of problems. Dallas, rocked this last couple of weeks with problems, big problems, with Tony and later with the guy from Gateway, Robert. But those are just speed bumps. If your focus is on Jesus, those things aren't gonna challenge your faith, other than to be more diligent and more disciplined with knowing who God is and doing what he lived. All I want you to do is to show love and know me. Hosea 6:6.
Well, Bruce, thank you so much for taking time to share about publishing from the vantage point of a publisher, not just like an author, and then dropping some wisdom. So thank you.
Absolutely. It's great to spend time with you, Chad. Lord, I pray that you would bless the work of Chad's and his team's hands as they work with authors that you've gifted with messages, that you've gifted with writing skills, and that you will enable through the power of your working in the Holy Spirit to spread each of these messages that Chad is teaching and publishing